Okay, brace yourself for chapter 20. Oh, the action never stops. So many great events in the last few chapters. Most notably, probably, is that Goethe has found the Welcome Building, which is the building that her supposedly her father intended her to find, and she found inside in the basement an air raid shelter that butts up against the death strip, right, like right above that. Right above that area in the air raid shelter is the Berlin Wall, and she contemplates the possibility of tunneling over to West Berlin. And at first, her brother Fritz does not agree. He thinks that's too dangerous, but he almost escaped on his own by swimming the Spree River. But he finally comes around to her idea, and they're thinking that it might just be the right thing to try to tunnel underneath this building and go through underneath the death strip and try to get to West Berlin. So exciting stuff. Okay, this chapter begins with a quote by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he was a German writer and statesman. And he said, "What is not started today is never finished tomorrow." In other words, this is a beautiful way of saying don't procrastinate. And I would encourage you to not procrastinate with your homework. Okay, before we get started, just a quick reminder, have your annotation sheet nearby and stop to take annotations or notes whenever you deem it the right time, and make sure that you're taking good notes. Here we go. The tunnel was underway by the time I got into the shelter after school. Fritz had been let out earlier than me and was already hard at work. Where he could have barely fit his body inside the gap yesterday, now he had carved out a small cove about 2 meters deep. It looked beautiful. I couldn't keep my smile from spreading. "If you work that fast every day, we'll have supper with Papa and Dominic next week." "No, not in time for supper, perhaps, but we'll share their dessert," Fritz laughed, and pulled from his pocket a letter from Mamma. Before I could read it, he said, "Oma Gertrude was worse than she thought." Okay, let's remember, who's Oma Gertrude? Yeah, Oma means grandma in German, and their mother has gone to go visit her mother. So their grandma, Oma Gertrude, over in the country, right? So she's out of the city right now, and she left Fritz and Gerta to take care of themselves for a few days while she's gone. But it looks like Oma Gertrude was worse than she thought. She sent a little money for groceries and expects to be there for at least another few weeks. "This is the time we need, Gerta. I think we should try to have the tunnel built by then." Okay, and this was on page 127. We are now at the top of page 128. There was a downside to this news, though. Fritz was wearing a new outfit, worker's overalls, and he had a set for me. Yours might be a little large, but it was the smallest size they had. I had to use Mama's grocery money to buy them. "But why?" Mine was brownish gray, and the material was scratchy. I would have to stuff my skirt into the pant legs, which would make it even more uncomfortable. Even the hardest working farmer would never come home as dirty as we're going to get. These clothes need to stay in this room, and we'll put them on over our other clothes to work. That way, even if our hands get dirty, we won't draw nearly as much attention. And don't worry, we won't get hungry. Mama has some food saved up in the cupboards. If we're careful, we'll have what we need until she sends us more money. I'd looked in the cupboards that morning, and there wasn't as much as he made it sound like. But this tunnel was my idea, so I couldn't very well start complaining about it. I slipped the outfit on over my school clothes and zipped it up. "It feels like I'm playing dress up in Papa's old clothes," I said as I tried to roll the pant legs higher. Fritz laughed again and helped me with the sleeves, then went back to work. He pointed behind us to a bucket with a handle. "Your job will be to get rid of this dirt the best you can. The bucket will get heavy if you fill it too full. So just," top of page 129, "just scoop in as much dirt as you can carry, dump it out in the basement above us, and come back for more." Again, I wasn't too excited about that idea, but he was right. Fritz would dig much faster than I could, and someone did have to remove this dirt. Without complaining, I set to work at my end of the job. A lot of dirt was already piled up in the shelter, so I tipped the bucket to its side, pushed dirt in until it was halfway full, and then hooked the handle over my arm to walk up the ladder. Once at the basement level, I peered around to be sure we were alone, then climbed the rest of the way up. I emptied the dirt into the farthest corner. A lot more dirt was going to fill this room, and it was better to use the space wisely. Then back down I went. By the time I did all that, Fritz had loaded 5 or 6 times that amount of dirt into the room. I needed to work faster. So I did, but it didn't take many more trips up and down the ladder to realize I'd never be able to keep up with him, and I was already getting tired. Maybe Fritz's job required more muscle, but I became convinced that mine was harder. I filled the bucket with as much dirt as as I could possibly lift, and then had to balance that while climbing a ladder. After only an hour, my arms were beyond tired, and my legs were worse. I became thirsty, and the overalls were so warm, I wondered how long it would take before I baked in them. Okay, top of page 130. Fritz eventually noticed me slowing down and told me just to stay up top and empty the bucket for a while. He would do the work of filling it and climbing the ladder. His buckets were more full than mine had been, so after only a few trips, he doubled the size of our dirt pile in the room. After an hour of this, he handed me another bucket and said, "Most of the dirt that I dug out is emptied. Do you think we should quit for the night?" Yes! If he was going to end his sentence any other way, I wasn't interested. Come back down into the shelter, Goethe. You need to see how far we've gotten. The hopeful tone of his voice gave new strength to my legs, and I hurried back down the ladder. As tired as I was, I still thought it was the most fabulous thing I'd ever seen. We were probably at least as far as the exterior wall of the Welcome Building, which meant if we were up on the surface, we would now be openly standing inside the death strip, somewhere between those two impassable walls of East Berlin's border. Okay, so the death strip, if you recall, there's the border between West and East Berlin, right? So on that border, on the other side of that border is West Berlin. And then to the east side, there's actually some dead space before you get to the Berlin Wall. And remember, the Berlin Wall is the one that has, the electric fence, and it's got barbed wire and stuff. So that dead space in between the actual border of the actual border where there was another wall, and then the Berlin Wall, that's called the death strip. And it's actually quite a wide area. It has, explosives there and mines, and it has, the Grenzers, the border guards are continuously monitoring it day and night. They've got guard dogs and things. They've got watchtowers that they can look out to see a long ways. There's a sand strip there. So if somebody were to somehow get, trying to cross through the death strip, their footprints would be in the sand and they would be able to track them down. What else was there? All kinds of dangers. So yeah, she's saying that right up above them, if they were to go directly above where they're standing, they would be standing in the middle of the death strip. Or at least openly, not necessarily in the middle, but they would be openly standing in the death strip. Okay, we're right down here, second paragraph from the bottom on page 130. We still had a long way to go. I wasn't kidding myself about that. But if the rest of our digging went as well as today had gone, we would be to the other side in no time, maybe even farther. Why bother stopping once we're in West Berlin? I said, laughing. Couldn't we keep tunneling until we reached France? Top of page 131. Absolutely, he said with a grin. I'll make that tunnel come up right beneath the Eiffel Tower, and we'll have the most original view of it anyone has ever seen. We laughed at that as we stripped off our overalls and hung them over the bench on the other end of the shelter. We had set the bucket and shovel beside them, then climbed the ladder and replaced the heavy door over it. There's no point in covering this door with dirt, I said. I had done that in past visits to hide the door in case someone did happen to look in here. But now, if someone looked in, they were bound to see the piles of fresh dirt in the corner. They'd know right away that something was up. We wouldn't be able to hide the evidence of our tunnel. All we could hope was that nobody would look. Fritz agreed with me and then said it was extra important that we replace the boards over the windows so they look undisturbed. Maybe I'll even reinforce them with new boards, he said. I'll make it impossible for someone to peek inside. After we got into the evening light, we realized the overalls might have protected our clothes, but our faces and hands were both smeared with dirt. This won't do, Fritz said. We look like we've been tunneling. Nothing else could explain our appearance. I pointed to the pond at the far end of the dirt patch and the irrigation river running through it. The problem was that to get there, we'd have to leave the shadow of the wall. Top of page 132. Fritz looked around us. They'll see our footprints here. Better they see them all over, like a gardener's would be, instead of only near the building. We have to take the risk at some point. If they come, then we'll show them where we want to put the garden. I straightened up beside him, and though my legs felt numb, we casually walked toward the pond. Once there, we lay on our stomachs and washed our hands, arms, and faces. So far, nobody had come. Maybe this was okay with the guards. Maybe. We would have washed more, but dark was coming fast, and we knew the guards in the watchtower would have spotted us by now. They didn't seem to mind that we were standing on this land, but their feelings would change after curfew, which was strictly enforced. It was time to go. Okay, so that was a common thing, in many communist countries, actually. But at this time, they had a curfew where nobody could be out after a certain time. You had to be home. And so kind of interesting stuff. We definitely don't have curfews around here. Tomorrow we must bring water to drink, I told him as we hurried home. Yes, that and some food. A smile started in the center of my heart and warmed every inch of me. No matter how hard today had been, how hungry, tired, and thirsty we both were, Fritz planned to tunnel again tomorrow too. Okay, let's jump right into chapter 21. Here we go. It starts with an old German proverb that says, "To begin is easy. To persist is art." Oh man, isn't that true, right? It's always easy to start things, but sticking with it and seeing them through to the end is where the trick is. Okay, our progress over the next few days was dreadfully slow. The large clumps of dirt turned into even larger rocks that seemed as impassable as the Berlin Wall itself. Fritz and I spent hours chipping at the edges to pull the rock out, but too often that just led to finding other rocks in our way. Fritz stood back and examined the dirt wall. If this is how the rest of tunneling will be, we might as well give up. Let's turn sideways and go around it. I brushed my sweaty hair out of my face. It can't all be rock under here. What if it is? It could take months. Then let it take months, I said. At least we're still moving forward. I don't have months, Fritz said. It's just weeks until they'll expect me for military duty. Okay, so remember, Fritz is going to turn 18 very soon, and the Stasi has a file on him. And what that means, if you recall, is that he is going to be forced into the military as soon as he turns 18, among other things. I was ready to keep arguing, but he only picked up the shovel again. So there's really no time for complaining, eh? Top of page 134. He was the one who'd complained, not me, and besides, I was still feeling the surge of energy from our brief argument. I used it to pry my fingers into the dirt and yank out one of the larger rocks. Dirt tumbled over my shoulders when it fell, but I only smiled. I felt better now. I should make you angry more often, he teased. Help me carry this rock up. Then I've got some work to do above. Earlier that morning, Fritz had removed the hinges from a closet door in our apartment. While I screw these on the wood boards over the window, maybe you can use the rocks to build us a stairway, he said. That way it's not such a climb for you to get out. I did as he suggested, but spent most of that time thinking about how lucky I was to have Fritz here. He was resourceful and good with his hands, so good, in fact, that I sometimes felt like a useless child getting in his way. Sure, I helped him dig and carried buckets of dirt into the basement, and every night I was just as tired as he was when we stumbled back to the apartment. But I had also begun to appreciate how hard this tunnel project was, how much bigger than what I had first imagined. On one of those walks home, we were stopped on the street by Frau Eberhardt. Okay, if you recall, Frau Eberhardt is their neighbor, right? And what do we know about Frau Eberhardt? What do we know about her? And also, what does Frau mean? Frau is not her first name. Yeah, Frau means Mrs. in German. So Fräulein is Miss, Frau is Mrs. So she's Mrs. Eberhard. And what we know about her is she is nosy. She is a nosy neighbor in other people's business, right? And what Goethe had expressed in a previous chapter is that she's kind of worried that a nosy person like Mrs. Eberhard would be an informant to the Stasi. Like if she found something suspicious, she would probably report it to the Stasi. And you might wonder why someone might do that. But in communist governments like this, how they have things set up, if you were willing to rat on people you knew, whether they were family members or friends or neighbors, if you were willing to report things to the Stasi, you would be rewarded by the government for those things. You might get extra money or extra tickets for food rationings, or you might get, you get to live in this nicer home or apartment, right? Okay, so that's what she's worried about with Frau Eberhardt. So let's start at the beginning of that paragraph again. On one of those walks home, we were stopped on the street by Frau Eberhardt, who patrolled the front of our apartment building better than most of the guards in the watchtowers. She saw the dirt on our hands and faces and waddled over to us. Yeah, I like that description. She waddled over. That tells you a little bit about her appearance. Okay, top of page 135. I looked up at Fritz. Remember, Frau Eberhardt thinks we've been gardening. Gardening what? He asked. I didn't answer because Frau Eberhardt was upon us then, and he could only smile politely at her. What a pleasure to see the two Low children. If she felt any pleasure, it was in watching us squirm. I can tell you've been busy. Her eyes flicked from me up to Fritz. I wasn't sure which of us was dirtier. We hadn't taken the time to wash off in the pond before leaving tonight. Fritz worried if we did that too often, it would stand out to the guards. Maybe that was a mistake, though, because sure as anything, we stood out now. We might as well have pasted signs on our chests announcing our plans. We have been busy, I said, a bit too defensively, and we're late for supper, so if you'll excuse us. Late for whose supper? Frau Eberhardt asked. Your mother isn't there to prepare it. Where has she been? I miss visiting with her. She didn't miss visiting with Mama because my mother avoided her like she'd dodge a black cat sitting on a crack in the sidewalk. Okay, here's a little bit of an idiom right here, right? Like we know that black cats are in our culture sometimes considered to be unlucky, and if you're on a crack, that's considered to be unlucky too. So she's saying that her mama does not. Her mama tries to avoid Frau Eberhardt as well. Our mother is helping our grandmother recover from an injury, Fritz said. We expect her back very soon. Top of page 136. Maybe tonight, I offered, which is why it would be rude to be late. Even as the words fell from my mouth, I could have kicked myself for saying them. Why use such a stupid lie to remind her that I had already tried to lie before? Fritz covered for me. Goethe means that we are hungry and need to get some supper. We wish our mother was home to share it with us, but if she isn't, we expect her soon. Let's hope so. Frau Eberhard pursed her lips and began examining us again. It's not wise to allow young people too much time on their own. Children will get into trouble. I'm not a child anymore, Fritz said. By the end of this month, I'll join the military. And how will you fill your time until then? I heard you're not working as a bricklayer anymore. So yeah, she's quite the gossip, right? She's nosy and she's a gossip. Gardening, I said. That garden I told you about. We've been working on it. Where is it? Frau Eberhard asked. I used to love to garden, and I would love to come by and give you some advice. We'll take you there sometime. I took Fritz's arm and started to walk forward with him. Thanks for your help, Frau Eberhard. We'd better go. Once we were inside, Fritz stared down at me and shook his head. Even before he spoke, I understood his concern. Frau Eberhard wouldn't go away, and she would expect to see evidence of a garden. Top of page 137. We haven't pulled a single weed, Fritz said, nor do we have permission to garden there, or any tools or seeds to get started. This is a big problem, Goethe. I agreed completely, but after another long day of digging and pulling out rocks, my brain felt as rubbery as my arms and legs. We were running out of food in the apartment, but that was okay too. As tired as I was, I didn't feel all that hungry anyway. I barely took enough time to wash off before I fell onto my bed, already asleep as my head hit the pillow. Okay, that is the end of chapter 21. Let's jump right into chapter 22, which starts with another quote from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He's a German writer and statesman, and he said, "As soon as you trust yourself, you will know how to live." Like that. Okay. I slept late the next morning, and when I awoke to bright sunshine, I darted from my bed. Why was it so quiet in here? Had Fritz overslept too? He wasn't in his room, and when I called his name, there was no answer. Now, in a panic, I ran into the front room. He was definitely gone, and his shoes were missing from beside the door. My first thought was that he had gone over to the welcome building on his own, but I hoped that wasn't the case. We had agreed that it was always safer for the two of us to go there together. Still, I went on a hunt for my shoes wherever I had pulled them off in the fog of last night. While looking for them, I spotted a note on the kitchen table from Fritz. It only said, "Be back soon. Stay here." Top of page 139. There was no word about where he had gone, or why, or how long he would be gone, other than soon, which was useless. Was it something dangerous? Was that why he chose to go alone, to keep me safe? Because if so, then how could I be sure he would be back soon, or even that he would come back at all? With my heart threatening to pound out of my chest, I began pacing the floor. He'd said nothing last night about any errands. Claudia had broken off their relationship, so he wasn't sneaking out to spend time with her. Or at least I thought the relationship was over. If she wanted him back, I knew he'd agree to it in an instant. He talked about her all the time while we were digging, but our conversations about her always ended with him knowing they could never be together. Claudia was fiercely loyal to her father, and her father was no less loyal to the GDR. Remember, that's the acronym that stands for their government. He wouldn't trust Fritz within a kilometer of her. Finally, I gave up pacing, not because my anxiety was any better, but because I suspected whoever was on the other end of the hidden microphones might somehow figure out I was pacing and wonder why. So remember, their apartment is bugged. This Stasi has microphones set up in there, and they are listening to the things that the Lows are saying. We had dishes in the kitchen sink that hadn't been done in days. I washed those up and then swept the floor of all the dirt we had tracked in. Slowly, I became absorbed in that work, because even if I didn't know what was happening with Fritz, at least I was doing something. Top of page 140. I went to make my bed, but realized the sheets were filthy from the dirt that came in on my hair and clothes at night. It didn't seem right to make up an unclean bed, but I didn't feel like washing the sheets and hanging in them to dry either. A quick glance at Fritz's bed showed his was even worse than mine, and I left them both unmade. It was only then, as I slowed down, that I realized how hungry I was. I'd missed supper last night, and the sandwiches I made for Fritz and me at lunch got thinner every day. So remember, their mother is gone for a few weeks now, and she left them money for food, but Fritz had to buy them overalls to cover up their work clothes, right? And so, they have less money than they had planned on. Fritz hadn't told me how much money Mama had sent in her last letter, but he felt like we ought to save whatever was left for tunneling supplies rather than groceries. The more I went through our empty cupboards, the more I disagreed. We needed food. Mama kept a cookie jar on top of the refrigerator. I never went into it because, as far as I could tell, it had never held cookies or sweets of any kind. But our food supplies were getting low. If she had stashed anything in there, I wanted it. Okay, I was kind of surprised the first time I read that they had a refrigerator, because if you recall, they're living in East Germany, and a lot of families don't even have things like that. Some don't even have, electricity or running water. So that's kind of lucky that their family has a fridge. I opened the cookie jar, and immediately all my hopes deflated. It was empty, of food anyway, darn. An old envelope was at the bottom, though, and I pulled it out, then caught my breath in my throat. It was a letter from Papa. The stamp dated it to September 1961, about the time the wall replaced the barbed wire fence. Okay, so that was way back, right? I pulled out his letter, which began, "To my dear family." But every line after that, this is top of page 141, But every line after that was blacked out with thick black marker, every single line. Okay, so this is what they would do often in communist countries is if you were to send a letter, because remember, they don't have, text messaging or email or things of that nature. You would write to someone, but the government would open up your mail. They would look through it and they would censor things by blacking them out. Any information that they felt they didn't want to be shared, they would just black it out. So you would get these partial letters, and have to figure out what the person was trying to say. No wonder Papa never wrote to us. There was no point in it. The envelope was addressed with our apartment number, and the return address came from West Berlin. If the return address was current, then that was where Papa lived now. And maybe his letters were blacked out, but if I wrote him, would my words be blacked out too? I couldn't see anything wrong with a daughter writing to her father in the West. No matter who the father was, and no matter what the daughter really wanted, it should be okay. Well, that last part wasn't true. I had to be careful. The letter I wrote to my father was simple. I said nothing more than what absolutely had to be written and weighed each word carefully, just in case the Stasi intercepted it. Papa, I hope all is well with you. We are all fine, though Mama is out of the city to take care of Oma Gertrude's broken leg. Could you please send some money to help us plant a garden? Fritz is looking for work, and we need a little extra. Love, Goethe. Okay, top of page 142. I debated whether to mention anything about the tunnel, but couldn't figure out a way to word it that wouldn't tip off the Stasi. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, none of them more important than whether Fritz and I were doing what he wanted by digging that tunnel. But I wasn't foolish enough to write a question like that. Before I could talk myself out of sending the letter, I put a stamp on it and then ran down to the street to drop it in the post office box. That's where I was when Fritz came running up to me with a paper in one hand and a bag in the other. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Nothing." I frowned at him. "Where were you? I've been worried." Fritz pulled me near the wall of our building and showed me the paper. They're called, oh man, let's see if I can read this. They're called Schrebergarten, allotted spaces for interested families. The state gives permission to garden in certain areas, legally. I went to ask if we might use that small piece of land near the Welcome Building to make a garden. This paper is our permit, and in this bag I even have some small gardening tools and corn seeds. They just gave them to us? The condition is that we don't own the land, and we certainly can't live on it. And technically, they'll own everything we grow, though they said we could share in the harvest. They don't mind that it's so near the wall? Top of page 143. A lot of farmland comes up to the wall, so they're used to it. Fritz's smile was so wide it nearly spread off his face. Don't you see? We have a reason to be there now. Even their permission. We don't have to sneak on and off the property anymore. My brow furrowed. We have files, Fritz. Why would they give us permission? Fritz shrugged. The Stasi keep the files. Maybe the agriculture office doesn't know about them. He showed me the paper again. This is good news, Goethe. This could save us. I couldn't share his relief or excitement. This only changed one big problem into a different sort of worry. Yes, but now we'll have to build a garden instead of digging. When are we going to do that? Fritz smiled, still pleased with himself. We'll figure it out, Goethe. Now, come on. We've got work to do. Okay, let's jump right into the top of page 144 into chapter 23. Here we go. It starts with a German proverb that says, a steady drop will carve the stone. Okay, so meaning, over time, even just a drop of water over millions of years will carve into stone, right? We know that things like the Grand Canyon and things were created by erosion over years and years by water and other elements. Okay, as slow as it was to dig out the rock in the tunnel, at least we had been making progress there. The next few days were spent almost entirely in the garden, working hard for no other purpose than as a cover for what we were actually doing, or should have been doing. I didn't mind the idea of gardening, but the weeds were thick and sometimes thorny, and by the third day it was hard to care about the dirt out here when I really wanted to be down in the tunnel working. After an entire afternoon of pointless, sweaty labor, I didn't think the weeds looked any better than when we first began. When the heat of the day hit us, Fritz and I decided to sneak inside the building to get back to our real work. As before, we went into the tunnel while I removed dirt with the bucket. Sorry, he went into the tunnel. Top of page 145. But the small basement room was already piling high with dirt, and that bothered me. We had a long way to go before we reached the west. What if we ran out of places to store the dirt? Something needed to be done with it. I briefly toyed with the idea of returning to the weeding. At least the weeds didn't require me to think so much. Then I smiled as a wonderful idea came to my mind. If it worked, it would solve both my problems. Rather than dump out the bucket inside the basement, I opened the boarded window and dumped it there. It made a much smaller pile than I expected, so I refilled the bucket from the dirt already in the basement and dumped it outside too. After 5 or 6 loads of dirt, I climbed outside and then used the small hand rake from the state to spread the dirt around. It went down smooth and dark and covered up every single weed beneath it. I didn't need to pull weeds. I could cover them up. Sure, our vegetable seeds wouldn't grow very well once they hit that hard ground a few centimeters down, but I didn't care about that. I didn't plan to be here that long. With renewed energy, I began emptying dirt from the basement. The routine was the same, to dump several loads at once and then spread it out. I did it slowly and tried to make it look as if I was pulling weeds rather than covering them. The watchtower was far enough away that unless the guards looked carefully, there wouldn't be any, top of page 145, there wouldn't be any reason to investigate further. Or at least, I hoped not. I was always listening for the approaching sounds of one of their vehicles. Okay, I just wanted to quickly point out they used the word further there, right? We learned the difference between farther and further. Farther, we would use that word when we have physical distance. But when she's saying they don't need to investigate further, that's not a physical distance, right? It's meaning that they don't need to investigate more. So that's why we use further instead of farther, which is what you would use for distance. Okay, after a while, Fritz called up to ask what I was doing, and when I invited him up to see it for himself, he only chuckled and brushed his hand across my head. Trust you to do so much hard work to get out of other work, he said, but don't go so fast. If someone is looking for progress, they'll never believe we got all that weeded in a day. He was right, and I returned to carrying dirt back up the ladder. Over and over, that was my routine. Climb down to the air raid shelter, scoop dirt into the bucket, hook it over my arm, climb up the ladder, dump it out. Repeat, again and again and again. Rest a little, and then start all over. I'd lost track days ago of how many times I made the climb. I could do this now in my sleep. Who knows? I was so tired. Maybe I did. I usually took my rests in the shelter while I watched Fritz's progress. He was nearly 5 meters into the tunnel and kept track of how straight it was with some boards he had nailed together perpendicular to each other. If one end was always kept straight with the shelter's entrance, the other end should point like an arrow in the direction he should dig. One late afternoon, Fritz said he would lift the buckets for me if I would go and find water to refill his canteen. Top of page 147, it required a short walk back to the main part of the city, but I was eager for the change of routine. I stripped off my overalls and stopped by the pond to wash my face and hands. If I was going to convince a restaurant to give me water, I needed to be presentable enough to walk inside. Then I set off toward a nearby sausage shop where my family used to eat. When I was almost to the restaurant, my eye roamed across the street to a building that had been bombed during the war and still hadn't been repaired. Attempts had been made to clear it some years ago. I could tell that because of some rusty old machinery and other pieces of equipment left on the site. There was even a long rope with a pulley attached so that the heavier items could be lifted onto trucks. A pulley! My mind began racing as I pictured that very item in the basement of the Welcome Building. With a pulley, there would be no more climbing up and down the ladder. Fritz could fill the dirt below, and I could pull it up with a rope and then empty it into the basement. We could work twice as fast with half the effort. I needed that pulley. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can picture what she's describing here, but a pulley has like a round disc type thing that you can feed a rope up and around it, right? And then you can pull that rope and it will lengthen or shorten the other side of the rope, right? And it makes things easier to lift, things like buckets of dirt, right? So she wants that pulley. Gerta, what are you doing here? I swerved around and saw that Anna had come up behind me. Her mother was already seated inside the restaurant where I intended to get water, though I hadn't noticed either. Top of page 148. I hadn't noticed either of them before now. It shouldn't have surprised me to see them here. This was their neighborhood, after all. But of course, she would be surprised to see me, and looking as dirty as I'm sure I did. Okay, remember the last time Gerta tried to speak to Anna, Anna got really mad at her. She got really angry. Gerta was trying to talk to her as though they were friends again. And then she mentioned something about making money with her garden, being able to sell the things from her garden. And Anna got really angry, started screaming at her about how all Gerta cares about are things and why can't she just be content with what they have there in the East. So yeah, this is the very next time seeing her. I stepped back and forced a smile to my face. Fritz and I are gardening, like I told you about earlier. I just came to refill our canteens. Let me get it for you, she said, and then wrinkled up her nose. No offense, but you smell like you're up to your eyeballs in gardening. That was true enough, in a way. I handed her our canteens, and she took them inside while I waited, trying as hard as I could not to look at the pulley on the other side of the street. It was only attached by another thick rope. With a good knife, I could cut it free. But when? Certainly not on a day as busy as this one. The problem was that in this neighborhood, every day was busy. It was only at night, after curfew, when everything went quiet. After a few minutes, Anna emerged with full canteens of water, so cold I could feel it through the metal. I wanted to gulp down an entire one right then. Okay, just really quickly, since she mentioned a curfew, remember in a lot of communist countries, and they'll often have a curfew where people have to be home at a certain time at night. They can't be out and about, right? So she's saying the streets will be emptier then after curfew. Thank you, I said rather awkwardly. She called out a "You're welcome" as I walked away, which thoroughly confused me. Were we friends again? Why? Nothing had changed, unless it had changed on her end. Maybe the Stasi had decided to leave her family alone, and she felt safe to be friends with me again. I didn't know, top of page 149, I didn't know if I was ready for that. After all, she had treated me horribly over the last couple of months, and I had much bigger things on my mind than anyone's friendship, which included a need to get into her apartment, I reminded myself. For the sake of the tunnel, I would have to make things good between us, and soon. So in a previous chapter, she and Fritz had decided they need to know how big the death strip is. They don't know how far they need to tunnel. And Anna's apartment overlooks the death strip. So they made the plan that she somehow needs to make things good with Anna and find a reason, whether it's to get a drink of water or something, a reason to go to Anna and go inside her apartment. But in the meantime, I had a pulley to steal. All right, getting exciting. Okay, don't forget to take fantastic notes. Use your annotation sheet and make some annotations.